If you are even remotely interested in biblical history, you have undoubtedly heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They are widely believed to be the most significant archaeological find of the 20th century, and for good reason. The Dead Sea Scrolls give us a rare window into what Judaism looked like in the centuries leading up to the birth of Jesus. And yet, the texts that give us this unique window are often the texts that are most overlooked. But unless you've really dug into the Dead Sea Scrolls and studied them extensively, my guess is they contain many stories you've never heard of before, and ones that might even surprise you. Today, when the Dead Sea Scrolls are discussed in pop culture, like on TikTok or in YouTube videos, most of the discussion focuses on a few of the scrolls that contain biblical stories and how they compare to the Masoretic text, which is the authoritative Hebrew text of the Old Testament. This has especially been the case since Wes Huff's appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast. And I think this can lead some people to believe that the Dead Sea Scrolls are just a few old biblical scrolls found in the caves of the Judean desert. But this is certainly not the case. The Dead Sea Scrolls are best described as a library of almost 1,000 manuscripts dating between 250 BCE to roughly 68 CE, when the authors of the scrolls were ultimately slaughtered at the hands of the Romans. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain all kinds of literature, not just biblical. As a matter of fact, the biblical texts found in the Dead Sea Scrolls collection don't even make up a third of the texts discovered. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain sectarian texts, non-biblical Jewish wisdom and apocalyptic literature, pesharim, targums, calendars, and even tefillin, which are the parchment slips placed inside a phylactery. So as you can see, with almost 1,000 manuscripts as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls collection, it would be crazy to just focus on a few of the biblical manuscripts and not analyze the broader context in which those manuscripts come and the other texts that are available there. Yet the fact remains that most of our discussions about the Dead Sea Scrolls focus on a select few. But why are so many Dead Sea Scrolls overlooked? Well, I think there are many reasons to this. First, the average person is just more interested in the biblical scrolls because it's something they're already familiar with. Many Christians, for example, are interested in textual criticism, and they tend to look at the scrolls to try and verify the effective transmission of the biblical text. This is clearly what Wes Huff was doing on the Joe Rogan podcast. The second reason so many texts are overlooked is because many of them are extremely fragmentary, meaning they don't contain the entire story, just a small snippet. As a matter of fact, some of the manuscript fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls range from the size of a note card to even smaller, to basically just an unintelligible scrap. Typically, people aren't overly interested in reading a text that only has 4 sentences and no context as to what's going on. And lastly, I think the Dead Sea Scrolls are often overlooked because they require some level of expertise to understand, and it's difficult for the average person to situate them historically and to see why they matter in the first place. So in this video, I'd like to take a deeper look at how the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, what they actually are, who might have written them, and then lastly dive into the exciting world of the often overlooked texts to see what they might reveal about a unique branch of Judaism in the years leading up to the birth of Christ. Let's begin with the discovery. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered sometime between 1946 and 1947. The exact date of the discovery will never be known for sure because they were originally found by a goat herder of the Ta'amira Bedouin tribe. The word Bedouin comes from the Arabic term Badawi, meaning desert dweller. The official story of how the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered likely has many legendary and non-historical elements to it. But having said that, the story typically goes something like this. A group of 3 young Bedouin boys were herding goats along the foothills of the Judean wilderness when one goat happened to go astray, wandering to the foot of the nearby cliffs. One boy in particular, later said to have been Muhammad ed-Dib, known as the Wolf, followed this goat to the entrance of one of the many caves that could be found throughout the cliff face. When Muhammad saw the entrance to the cave, he, for whatever reason, decided to throw a stone into the dark recesses of the cave. Some theories suggest he threw the stone to scare off a snake. At any rate, to his surprise, Muhammad heard the sound of shattering pottery, and upon further investigation, he noticed several large jars inside the cave. One version of the story suggests that he ran away immediately, fearing the wrath of the desert jinn. I'd be afraid too. Whatever the real reason was, he eventually returned to the cave with a friend or two, and while rummaging around the cave, they claimed to have found a total of 10 jars, although later it was revealed that it was only 7 jars. But in one jar in particular, they found 3 bundles of scrolls, 2 of which were wrapped in a linen cloth. The Bedouin goat herds then returned to their camp, where they opened one of the bundles, revealing a long, unraveling strip of leather covered with strange writings. These writings piqued their curiosity, but they were initially of no obvious value to them, so the bundles they discovered accompanied them on their travels for the next few weeks. After some time, these newly discovered mysterious scrolls reached a man by the name of Khalil Iskandar Shahin, otherwise known as Kando, who worked in Bethlehem. Kando ran a cobbler's shop, so perhaps they thought he could use the leather texts for shoe repairs. Thankfully, Kando did not do this. Kando became curious about the writings, so he took them to St. Mark's Monastery, belonging to the Syrian church in Jerusalem. Nobody at the Syrian church in Jerusalem knew the contents of the scrolls either, but they were seen as potentially extremely valuable. So a search ensued for more scrolls, probably issued by Kando, or perhaps the bishop of the Syrian church, a man named Mar Athanasius Yeshua Samuel. What exactly happened next is shrouded in mystery, but it seems a hunt began for more scrolls because the number of texts discovered rose to 7, and 4 out of the 7 scrolls were purchased by Mar Samuel, the bishop of the Syrian church, who purchased them for what would today be roughly $100. At some point in the not-too-distant future, a Jewish scholar named Eliezer Sukenik from the Hebrew University caught wind of the fact that there were ancient scrolls with strange writing on them floating around Bethlehem. So in November of 1947, Professor Sukenik traveled to Bethlehem and purchased the remaining 3 manuscripts. Professor Sukenik tried to purchase Mar Samuel's 4 scrolls as well, but was unsuccessful. It was Professor Sukenik who was the first to appreciate the age and value of the scrolls. Mar Samuel, with his remaining 4 Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts, turned to the American Schools of Archaeological Research in Jordanian Jerusalem, where the scrolls were photographed by a man named John Trevor. Trevor, along with a few of his other colleagues, identified the texts as extremely old. Trevor then contacted W.F. Albright in Baltimore, who was a world-renowned archaeologist and epigrapher, who confirmed the scope of the find. Albright noted that the scrolls date from the time of Judas Maccabee, the time of Herod the Great, and the time of Jesus himself. The news broke worldwide on April 12, 1948. Now, a lot more could be said about the early days of the scrolls' discovery, but one thing I want to focus on is that the scrolls were discovered during a time of very high tensions in the region, with the United Nations proposing to partition Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states in 1947. In the years prior, the entire region, including modern-day Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, was called Palestine and was under British jurisdiction per the British Mandate of Palestine, which ran from 1920 to 1948. In 1948, when Britain withdrew, Israel declared independence, which led to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. As a result of that war, the land was divided in the following ways. Israel controlled most of the territory, becoming a new state. Jordan took control of the West Bank, including Bethlehem and the area around the Dead Sea, and Egypt took control of the Gaza Strip. As you can probably tell, wandering around the Judean wilderness looking for ancient scrolls was not a safe endeavor during this time. As a matter of fact, wandering around anywhere in the region during this time was not a safe endeavor. So the scrolls could not have been discovered at a more inopportune time. And it was because of this conflict that Mar Samuel brought the scrolls to the United States, where he put them up for sale. In 1954, an advertisement appeared in the Wall Street Journal for 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, which were purchased anonymously for $250,000 by the State of Israel, reuniting them with Professor Sukenik's 3 scrolls. Once the Arab-Israeli War was settled, the hunt for the cave that housed the 7 scrolls was on in full force, and in January of 1949, the cave was officially found. The cave was a little over a half-mile away from a settlement known as Khirbet Qumran, which was immediately dismissed as a Roman fort. 2 years later, though, archaeologists examined the evidence again and decided to excavate the site of Qumran to see if there was a link between the texts and the settlement. As this was going on, more manuscripts began showing up, being found in other caves nearby. Then the all-out hunt was on, a battle between the Bedouin and a team of archaeologists to find if any more caves with scrolls existed. To make a long story short, a total of 11 caves were discovered with over 900 manuscripts in total. The exact number of manuscripts discovered can vary depending upon who you ask. Remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls were very fragmentary, so knowing whether or not you had a unique manuscript or one that belonged to an existing manuscript was no small task, and it's a debate that scholars are still having even to this day. So obviously, many questions began burning in everyone's minds, like, what do these Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts say, and when will they be available for the public to read, and who wrote them, and do they have any connection to the Qumran settlement, and what do they reveal, if anything, about the Jewish matrix from which the Jesus movement emerged? Well, in order to answer these questions, let's talk about what the Dead Sea Scrolls actually are. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Dead Sea Scrolls are best seen as a library of ancient texts, over 900 manuscripts in total, containing a number of unique types of literature written mostly in Hebrew. But there are also a few texts written in Aramaic and a small handful written in Greek. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain all kinds of different types of literature, including sectarian texts, which we'll explore more in a moment, non-biblical Jewish wisdom and apocalyptic literature, Pesharim, which are commentaries on biblical texts. They found Targums, which are Aramaic translations of biblical texts. They found calendars, psalms, hymns, and parchment tefillin. So that's a lot of texts. Most Dead Sea Scrolls scholars tend to break down the text types into 3 distinct categories: biblical, non-biblical, and sectarian. So let's take a look at each of these and break down these categories one by one. First, the biblical texts. Again, these are probably the most well-known, but one thing that you might not know is that out of the 900 plus manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls collection, only roughly 250 or so are biblical in nature. I say 250 or so because it's difficult to know when you have a text from a biblical scroll or when a text is something else and it just so happens to quote a biblical passage. I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. In a text called the Damascus document, which fragments were found in caves 4, 5, and 6, we read the following passage. During all those years, Belial shall be unleashed against Israel, as he spoke by the hand of Isaiah son of Amos, saying, Terror, and the pit, and the snare are upon you, O inhabitant of the land. This passage isn't found in the Bible, but it quotes Isaiah 24:17. So as you can imagine, if you have a number of very small fragmentary manuscripts, how would you know if you have a biblical text or a non-biblical text that just so happens to quote a biblical passage? And that's just one problematic situation. Another would be that some texts are biblical, but the order in which they appear are totally different than what we have in our Bibles today. And so there's a few manuscripts in particular that seems like you're reading something out of the book of Leviticus, and then out of nowhere, Deuteronomy will show up. And then it'll seem like you're going back to Leviticus, and then Numbers will show up. And so what do you do with texts like these? Are they biblical? Well, in some ways, yes, because we know all of these passages from the Bible, but in another way, no, because we have no biblical manuscripts that put them in this strange order. And so these texts are often called the reworked Pentateuch. So this number of 250 biblical manuscripts is more of an average, and different scholars will give you a slightly different answer, depending upon how they categorize a biblical text. All of the Old Testament is represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls except for Esther, and we know that the community who wrote the scrolls likely did not celebrate Purim, the Jewish holiday that commemorates the events that took place in the book of Esther. This absence could be due to theological reasons, as Esther is the only book of the Hebrew Bible that does not explicitly mention God. As I mentioned earlier, the biblical books are currently a hot topic of discussion, and many YouTubers have ventured to make videos going into more depth on these particular scrolls, so I won't hash out all the details here. I will simply say that the Dead Sea Scrolls biblical texts do share many similarities with that of the later Masoretic text, but they are certainly not word-for-word verbatim. And some scrolls, such as 4Q Jeremiah B, contain a truncated version of Jeremiah where large sections of Jeremiah are missing, which correlates closer to the Greek Septuagint version of Jeremiah than the Masoretic text. Which leads me to my next point, that some biblical scrolls discovered clearly have a closer translation lineage to that of the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the text. And yet others still have more in common with the Samaritan Pentateuch. So the biblical texts as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls are quite fascinating, especially for those of you interested in textual criticism of the Old Testament. Okay, so that's the biblical category of literature, but what about the non-biblical category, or what we might call the late Second Temple Judaism literature? Well, this category includes anything found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that aren't biblical and that aren't sectarian, meaning they have nothing to do with the Yahad, or the community who wrote the scrolls, and that'll make more sense here in a moment. These non-biblical texts include things like hymns, non-biblical psalms, calendars, random historical texts, apocalypses like the Messianic apocalypse found in Cave 4. This category would include wisdom literature such as the Seductress and the Songs of the Sage. It would include interpretive texts such as the Genesis Apocryphon and the Pesher Nahum and Habakkuk, and a very interesting Cave 11 text titled The Heavenly Prince Melchizedek. And if that's not enough, also in this category are texts such as the Book of 1st Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Testament of Levi, the Samuel Apocryphon, and even a text titled The New Jerusalem. And then there are some miscellaneous texts that don't fit well into any subcategory, like the Copper Scroll, which is basically an ancient treasure map, and a few Cave 4 fragments that are simply titled cryptic texts. Hundreds of videos could be made going through all of these amazing non-biblical texts. These non-biblical texts are certainly more overlooked than the biblical scrolls, but the truly overlooked and eye-opening scrolls are the sectarian scrolls. These sectarian scrolls specifically have to do with the rules of the community, often called the Yahad. But what on earth is that? Well, one of the leading theories as to who and where many of these scrolls were written is that they were written by a group of Jews who broke away from the temple in Jerusalem, believing that the corruption of the temple had reached such a high level that abandoning it altogether was the best option. And these separatist Jews secluded themselves in the Judean wilderness, starting over as a new community of Jews completely and utterly dedicated to the laws of Moses found in the books of the Torah. And even still to this day, the best theory as to where these Jews lived was at the site of Qumran. Qumran was a settlement less than a mile away from 9 out of the 11 caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. The settlement was initially thought to be an abandoned Roman fort used during the first Jewish revolt from the years 66 to 73 CE. And while archaeologists do believe the Romans used the site at Qumran, they believe it was decades later, after the Jewish separatists living there had already fled or, more likely, had been killed. We will talk about who may have written and collected the scrolls more in a moment, but for now let's take a closer look at some of these sectarian texts and see what this separatist Jewish community might have been like. The first sectarian text I'd like to look at is called the Community Rule, or 1QS, meaning it came from Cave 1 at Qumran. The Community Rule is probably one of the oldest documents of the sect. Its composition may have originated around the year 100 BCE, and the Cave 1 copy itself is said to have been produced around 75 BCE. The Community Rule is a text intended for the leader of the community, a person often called the master, or sometimes called the guardian. The guardian was expected to uphold the laws of the community and to ensure they were being followed to a T. The Community Rule contains information regarding liturgical ceremonies, initiation rites, organization and discipline practices, sacred seasons, and even a tractate on the spirits of truth and falsehood. The community rule gives us a wonderful window into the community that likely lived at Qumran. And one thing that will immediately stand out to you when you read the text is that they were intense. These folks were not playing around. They had extremely high standards for how one could become a full member of the community, and they clearly had different levels or ranks within the community itself. Consider this passage from 1QS 1:16 through 18. All those who embrace the community rule shall enter into the covenant before God to obey all his commandments, so that they may not abandon him during the dominion of Belial, because of fear or terror or affliction. Here we can see that this community believed that there would be, or perhaps already was, a reign on earth of the spirit of darkness, and that they were to be ready and prepared to withstand the dominion of Belial, as they called it. The members of the community were called the sons of light and spirits of truth, whereas everyone else, presumably even the Jews living in Jerusalem who had corrupted the temple there, were part of the sons of darkness and the spirits of injustice. This text has a stark dualism, meaning there is a clear delineation between good and evil. This text also has a clear belief in predestination, that those who are the elect will be spared and those who are not will not. And that this has been predetermined before the foundations of the earth had been set. As I said, this community was intense. There is no sense that this community would have embraced the idea of love the sinner but hate the sin, which is a common thing you might hear in churches today. No, they did not seem to have any desire to convert people, but only to relish in God's righteous judgment of the wicked, which ended in the fires of hell. Yes, these texts do indeed speak of an eternal, conscious paradise for members of the community and an eternal, conscious hell for those outside the community. This community was instructed to unite completely with the Yahad with respect to the law, their unique rules, and even their possessions. Consider this passage from 1QS 6 through 7. Those of the community shall atone for all those in Aaron who have freely pledged themselves to holiness, and for those in Israel who have freely pledged themselves to the house of truth, and for those who join them to live in community and to take part in the trial of land. There will be judgment and condemnation for all those who transgress the precepts. Did you catch that? Condemnation for all those who transgress the precepts. And these precepts went beyond the biblical mitzvah, the famous 613 laws of Moses found in the Pentateuch. There were extra laws and rules specifically for this community. And these laws were so intense, they even had to do with bathroom rights. For example, we have evidence from a few of our scrolls that the members of the community were debating if a man is defiled if he pees into an unclean vessel. Does the defilement travel upstream? It seems members of the community were divided concerning this issue. And I should mention at this point that the community was only made up of men, at least in the early days of the Yahad. That's probably true. One slight difficulty with this conclusion is that there is a graveyard just outside the ruins at Qumran, and lo and behold, when the graveyard was excavated by archaeologists, skeletons of women and children were found. So it's possible this mandate of men only was rescinded at some point in time. The community rule tells us quite a bit about the community potentially living at the settlement of Qumran, but what exactly did they think they were doing out there in the middle of nowhere? Well, it turns out the answer to this question is actually incredibly shocking. Check out this passage from the community rule 1QS 8:13 through 16. And when these became members of the community in Israel, according to all these rules, they shall separate from the habitat of unjust men and shall go into the wilderness to prepare there the way of him. As it is written, prepare in the wilderness the way of the Lord, making straight in the desert a path for our God. This is a direct quote from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. But for many of you, you will be familiar with this passage from its usage in the Gospels. It's how John the Baptist is described in terms of why he is out in the wilderness baptizing people for the forgiveness of sins. The New Testament quotes the exact same passage as the community rule. Yet the community rule was written 150 or so years before the gospel accounts. So what does all of this tell us? Well, it tells us that for hundreds of years, Jews believed in a messianic figure coming to aid them in the battle against the forces of evil. This wasn't something just created in the New Testament, but this is something that Jews had believed in apocalyptic Judaism for centuries. And sure enough, the community at Qumran believed in a future coming Messiah. But there's a twist. Some sectarian texts, which would include the community rule, actually mention the possibility of 2 or perhaps even 3 messiahs. 1 QS 9:11. They shall depart from none of the counsels of the law to walk in the stubbornness of their hearts, but shall be ruled by the primitive precepts in which the men of the community were first instructed, until there shall come the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. The prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel? 2 messiahs, or maybe even 3 messiahs if you include the mysterious prophet as well? To understand the thought process behind this multiple messiahs theory, we must first realize that the Hebrew word Mashiach, translated as Messiah, simply means anointed one. And who in the Old Testament would be anointed? Well, kings and priests, of course, were always anointed with oil. So the idea is that there would come a kingly Messiah from the lineage of King David and a priestly Messiah from the lineage of Levi, and more specifically, Aaron. So the Dead Sea Scrolls community viewed these as 2 separate messiahs that were to come and usher in a new Jewish rule of autonomy and righteousness. Now, what about that mysterious the prophet guy? Who might he be? Could he be a kind of messiah as well? I think yes. In the Old Testament, we have a few examples of prophets being anointed with oil as well. This wasn't as common as a priest or a king being anointed, but Elisha in 1 Kings 19:16 was indeed anointed with oil. So technically, a prophet could also be a Mashiach or a Messiah also. So I hope this gives you a tiny little glimpse into what the community living at Qumran might have been like. And there's a ton more we could talk about just in relation to the sectarian texts. I mean, there's a number of texts that we just don't have time to dive into, like the Damascus document, the Temple Scroll, the War Scroll, the Messianic Rule, the amazing Hodayot, or the Thanksgiving hymns, which are said to perhaps have been written by the teacher of righteousness, who is another person who is endlessly fascinating that we could do an entire video on. But for the sake of timing, I'd like to switch gears. Let's turn our attention back to these sectarian Jews living at the site of Qumran. Who might they have been? I mean, we learned a little bit about their beliefs and their practices, but who were they? Were they simply unsatisfied Jews living out in the middle of nowhere, or is there more to the story? Well, before the discovery of the scrolls in the late 1940s, we already knew about 3 philosophical sects of the Jewish faith because of the writings of the first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. In Book 2, Section 119 of the Jewish War, Josephus writes, "For there are 3 philosophical sects among the Jews, the followers of the first of which are the Pharisees, of the second the Sadducees, and the third sect, which adheres to a strict discipline, are called Essenes." Already the Essenes seem like the perfect candidate for those who were members of the community at Qumran, because they certainly fit the bill of what Josephus describes as adhering to a strict discipline. We also learn from Josephus that the Essenes despise riches, they believe in the immortality of the soul, they have strict morning and daily routines of prayer, they have high purity practices, and they live communally, sharing all they have in common with each other. Then we learn a few more things about the Essenes by reading Philo of Alexandria, a first-century Hellenistic Jewish philosopher, who writes, "The Essenes live in villages, avoiding the cities on account of the habitual lawlessness of those who inhabit them. Some of their goods they have in common, and others belong to their individual owners." This sounds awfully like the community we read about in the sectarian scrolls of Qumran. It is for these reasons, and many others, that most Dead Sea Scrolls scholars tend to think the Essenes wrote and or collected the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts. The history of the Essenes at the Qumran settlement goes dark after the completion of the first Jewish revolt in which the Romans destroyed their main settlement. There is a consensus among archaeologists that the Romans destroyed the Qumran settlement around 68 CE. The leading theory as to why the scrolls were deposited in the caves and the cliffs of the Judean desert is that the Essenes living at Qumran could tell the Roman army was barreling down on them, and they might have to fight for their lives. The members of the community may have stashed them away in the caves to prepare for the ensuing battle. The members of the community must have thought that they were going to win the fight and return to the caves to retrieve their precious scrolls. But to the shock of all the members of the Jihad, they were not successful. All the members of the community either died fighting or fled for safety. So these scrolls went missing and faded into obscurity for almost 2,000 years until that fateful day in the mid-1940s when the Bedouin goat herder threw the rock into the cave, discovering a historical and religious revelation nobody saw coming. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay thirsty for knowledge.